Hello, and welcome to this presentation that's hosted by the Orthodox Christian Leadership Initiative. My name is Katherine Kahn, and I'm glad to join you today for a presentation about solving complex problems with diverse teams. And my hope is that the examples and stories that I can bring you will help you think about the problems that you face in your own leadership situations, and perhaps help you come up with new ways and more effective ways to address those. So I work in the field of international development and specifically agricultural development. And what my work aims to do is to help empower families around the world who rely on agriculture for their food and income to be able to produce more food sustainably, feed their families, and get out of poverty. So I have a presentation to share with you, which I will do now. And I will say that it's certainly more challenging for all of us to be connecting like this online instead of in person. But my hope is that you'll find some value in this content. I would invite you to grab a pen and paper to perhaps participate with some of the questions that I'll offer you. And then when we meet together live online towards the end of September, then we'll have an opportunity to interact. So as I mentioned, I work in the field of agriculture, and agriculture is really important because 3/4 of the world's poor people rely on agriculture to feed their families and for their livelihoods. So if we can help people to produce more food sustainably, then that builds their self-sufficiency, and it's a way to help those families get out of poverty. So I'd like to introduce you to a farmer I met some years ago. Her name is Christina Mwinjepe, and Christina farms a small plot of land outside Dar es Salaam in Tanzania. The crop that she's here with is cassava, which, as you can see, is a thick root crop. And for those in the USA, if you've ever eaten tapioca pudding, then you've eaten cassava. But in Africa and South Asia and South America, you know, many hundreds of millions of people rely on cassava as a daily food source. And Christina makes a kind of porridge out of this cassava to feed her family, generally for breakfast, but for other meals too. And if she has enough cassava, she'll also cut it into thin slices and fry them to make what we call cassava chips, and then sell those to local school children to earn income. But there's a big problem for like Christina to have reliable productivity of cassava. And the reason for that is there's some pretty serious cassava virus diseases that have severe symptoms. See, this one here is called cassava mosaic disease, and it results in very small roots and withered leaves. There's another disease called cassava brown streak disease caused by a different virus, which causes roots to rot. The viruses are caused by, the viruses are different types of viruses, as I mentioned. They're spread by white flies, or they're spread by human activities, because farmers will tend to cut the cassava and plant it. And when they do that, they often spread disease. So these virus diseases are really serious for the impact they have on people. And so this is another family in Tanzania that my colleague here, who's sitting on the ground in jeans, Joseph Ndunguru, visited this family when he was traveling around to surveil and understand the state of cassava diseases. And he came across this family that had really been impacted by cassava brown streak disease. And what you can see on the ground is what's left of their cassava harvest after they chipped away all of the rot from the roots. And the family looks very sad because, as Dr. Ndunguru explained, they knew that this was the harvest that they had to rely on for their food for the coming months. And that was, you know, a really serious situation to be in. Joseph is a very compassionate scientist, and I found this picture very moving because he's holding the hand of the grandmother of the family. And he told me that the grandmother had stopped eating at this point because she really wanted the children to have more food. And so, you know, he just had compassion for her. And in recognizing this terrible situation. I'm glad to say that I think this picture was taken probably around 2012. And some years later, Joseph did tell me that he'd been back to visit this family and that he was amazed that the grandmother had survived that season. She'd gotten through it with a lot of hunger, but you can see why it is so important for this family to have enough cassava. So I'd like us, and if you can grab a pen and paper, that would be wonderful. But just to think for a moment about if you were in that situation and imagine that you supported your family through small-scale agriculture so that you were dependent on whatever you produced to eat, but also on whatever you were produced to earn income. And if you were in that situation and you were able to earn some money because you had a good harvest, what would you prioritize to spend that money on? Now, in a live situation, I would generally ask this question and get responses from the audience. But I invite you just to take a moment and think about that and write down what you think would be your priority to spend money that you earned. If you looked at this picture, the children didn't have shoes, they're wearing quite old clothes. I imagine they're in a house that doesn't have electricity. Perhaps they would like a tin roof. But think about it for yourself. If that's what it took to support your family, what would you spend money on? So in the absence of people calling out answers, I'll tell you that the answer that most farming families give in Tanzania and in other countries in Africa is that they actually spend the money on their children's education. And so this is the situation for Christina Mwinjepe, the farmer I mentioned to you before. And here she is actually with Dr. Ndunguru. And this is her oldest son, Robert. And what Christina wanted more than anything for the money that she earned from selling cassava chips was to pay for Robert's school fees. And that is something that we see pretty typically. Cassava tends to be grown by women, particularly in East Africa. And they will take that income that they earn from it and use it to pay their children's school fees as a very, very high priority. Now, I think this is just an interesting example of what can happen if your mum makes and sells cassava chips to pay your school fees, because that's actually the situation of my colleague, Dr. Ndunguru. And this is a picture of Joseph Ndunguru. And he told me that he is a product of cassava, because as a young boy growing up in Tanzania, his mother used to make and sell cassava chips, and she would sell those. She would walk quite long distances to sell them, and she would use the money to buy his school uniforms and to pay for his fees. And so it's just been wonderful to see the way that someone like Joseph can now give back to his community by helping other cassava farmers. And Joseph actually led a project that we funded along with the UK government that was Cassava Diagnostics project that was all about understanding in East and Southern Africa the spread of diseases so that we could manage them more effectively. This, looking at cassava brown streak disease, this is a disease that was first identified in 1939 in Tanzania, but it has spread over the years. Not too quickly initially, but all the impacted by that spread, can suffer terribly from it. And there's the potential that this disease will spread across the entire continent where people are growing cassava. And so Joseph had been continually bugging me that we needed to pay more attention to cassava brown streak disease in West Africa. And after much consideration and trial and effort, we did actually a sister project in West Africa called WAVE, which is all about understanding and aiming to increase the productivity of tuber crops like cassava in West and Central Africa by managing these virus diseases. So this is the project that I'd like to tell you about in terms of the approach that they've been taking to address this complex problem. So WAVE, it stands for West African Virus Epidemiology, and it's led by a group of African national research programs to control root and tuber diseases. And the leader of the project is Dr. Justin Peter, and he shared these presentation slides with me and was happy for me to share them with you. So the project is led out of Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, and this is the university where Justin is based. And it really built from the experience in Tanzania. Now, it's interesting in this time of COVID, everybody is becoming more aware of disease modeling. But I think it's helpful to show how disease modeling for these plant diseases is actually being applied to help us address the problem. So what I'm showing you here is from a collaboration between the partners in East Africa and the University of Cambridge in the UK, where the modelers work. And on the left, you can see results from surveys of cassava diseases. If the green spots represent, places that were free from disease, and the red spots represent places that had cassava brown streak disease. Now, on the left, the actual results, so, based on the surveys that the scientists did, and on the right are the simulation of what was expected to be seen based on and careful analysis between, I think, about the year 2000 and 2006 of how the disease might spread. So the scientists took what they knew about the disease spread in the early 2000s, and then they pretended that they didn't know what happened from 2006 until 2017, and they simulated what they would expect to see compared to what they did see. So, and it's a little bit technical, we'll get on to the leadership things, but I just think it's an important example to understand that modeling, if it's done well and if it's done based on really good data, can reflect what actually happens in real life. And in this case, it does. So I'm just going to show that one more time. So hopefully that makes sense. But you can see that they're not exactly the same, but the pictures on the left and on the right match fairly closely. So what that means is that we have a fairly good understanding of how cassava brown streak disease is spreading. So with that fairly good understanding of how cassava brown streak disease spreads, you can then start doing predictive modeling to imagine, based on the data, what might happen. And so this is another simulation also from the University of Cambridge, working in partnership with scientists in Africa. And the initial part of the simulation is based on data that we have. So we know up until 2009, 2010, as the years go on, this is how cassava brown streak disease has spread. Now I'm going to pause this. Whoops. Okay, let's try that again. I would pause in 2018 because this is real data up until 2018, and then after 2018, it's a simulation of one scenario that may play out for how cassava diseases could spread. So if you see now, it's moving into 2020, 2021, 2022, and spreading across Africa. Again, this is a simulation, right? The spread of cassava brown streak disease. And what you'll see happen now is once the disease reaches Nigeria, there's a lot of cassava in Nigeria. It takes off very rapidly because there's so much cassava grown in Nigeria. So that's something that we want to avoid. So this is what could happen if the disease spreads, if it continues to spread. And we really want to avoid that because many millions of people in West Africa depend on cassava for their food. So we know that plant viruses or any kind of viruses in West Africa can change really quickly. And so there's been examples with cocoa. You might have heard about cocoa production being devastated in parts of West Africa. It probably helps chocolate be more expensive, but they've had a lot of problems in Ivory Coast with something called cocoa swollen shoot virus that they didn't address early. And then, of course, we had the Ebola epidemic that was pretty frightening in the region. So the point is that these diseases can explode suddenly into large-scale threats. So we supported this group of scientists in West Africa, first of all, to build their capacity. And this was an amazing story about the way the team, refurbished and actually built with local labor, really high-end laboratories to be able to understand and address these cassava virus diseases. They've been around the countries in West Africa, collecting data and understanding, where do we have which virus types, and having that knowledge really helps us to address it. So they looked not only for the cassava brown streak disease, which has not yet arrived in West Africa, which is great that it's not yet arrived. And they also looked for other types of viruses. This is part of a type that causes cassava mosaic disease, a particularly severe type of cassava mosaic disease. And they have found that in Benin in West Africa, but it hasn't yet spread widely. They've also, along with other colleagues, have discovered there's an unknown disease of cassava. It looks a bit like cassava brown streak disease, but it's not caused by the same virus. In fact, it looks like it's not caused by a virus, but the scientists are still studying it. But that's causing worry too, because it's spreading out of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So these are really complex challenges. And how can a small team of people address such a complex regional challenge? So I thought it would be helpful just to show this example of an agreement and certainty matrix as we think about problems. You know, some kind of problems, they're fairly straightforward. We can be quite certain how to solve them. There can be pretty high agreement on how to solve them. So an example for that could be baking a cake. It's fairly straightforward. If you follow the recipe, we know how that might work. But of course, not all problems are so simple and have best practice. We also have complicated problems. So that might be something like flying a rocket ship to the moon. It can be complicated, you need experts, but there is best practice, good practice. You can plan, you can predict, you can involve experts, and you can detach the cause. So you know there's cause and effect, right? If I do this, this will happen, even if it's spread out over time. But then we also have complex problems that often involve humans. So this might be raising a child. You can certainly take expert advice, scriptural advice as well on how to raise a child. But there are a number of different practices that you can use in that complex situation. And you may be able to look back and understand what worked, but it may be hard to exactly repeat a recipe. And so a lot of what I think we face, certainly in this situation I'm describing to you with agricultural development, is a complex problem. That we're trying to figure out ways to address this problem, and that takes experimenting in different ways, reflecting on it, understanding, but it also takes involving the people who are most impacted by the problem to try to understand the issue from their perspective and figure out together how to address it. Of course, then you can move into chaotic problems where it doesn't seem like there's a clear cause and effect. And in that situation, you really want to do your best to stabilize. But here, what we are trying to do is address complex problems. So I thought it would be helpful just to talk practically about the way that the WAVE team approached their leadership. And I think some important things that we did together was, first of all, we had this core team of 8 country team leaders, and we worked together on really building their capacity, technical capacity. I showed you a picture of one of the labs that they built, but also their own capacity in leadership and communication skills. Because this was a group of scientists, this was not a group of policy experts or people who were used to dealing with, you know, many different government leaders or other leaders. But we recognized early on how important it was for a problem like this to work with governments and to work not just nationally, but regionally, because these diseases, they spread, you know, without regard of national border. So the approach that we've taken is as the team is implementing, to keep learning and iterating together so that we can be more effective. I thought it would be helpful to give you just a couple of examples of ways to have effective meetings that can include and unleash everybody in addressing a complex problem. So what we did with the WAVE team was a really interesting experience in coming together, and one of the activities that we did was actually to map out the network of key groups that we needed to influence to address this problem of cassava viruses. So the key groups in this case were farmers, scientists who are in the project, scientists outside the project, donors who are actually helping provide the financing, but also governments. So governments, you know, they manage sanitary regulations, but they're also really responsible for the response. The level of farmer organizations and policies in place that can try to stop and restrict the spread of these diseases. So the way that we approached this, we actually worked with a group called Olivier Mythodrama, and we acted into the perspectives of each group in our system. So I spoke from the perspective of donors, other people spoke from the perspective of farmers, from the perspective of government, and we kind of gave speeches to each other and worked through the issues either from our own domain or as we imagined people who represented that group would experience it. And in this process, it was a very lively meeting, and it really brought home to us that we were not engaging with the government ministers. And so we practiced what we needed to say to them. So what did the scientists need to say to their government leaders to help them understand the importance of this problem and to try to address it together? So then the WAVE team returned home after this training, and they really worked hard at building strong, engaging strongly and getting buy-in from their government leaders. This is the lead scientist, Justin Peter, and he's meeting here with two senior officials in the government of Ivory Coast who've come to visit the lab that he had built. And then here he's engaging with a minister for higher education in meeting with cassava farmers to begin an awareness campaign about the threat of this disease and the need to combat it. Dr. Peter also and his team also worked hard with local leaders. So particularly in parts of West Africa, traditional leaders are very important. And this is an emir in a northern state of Nigeria who Justin visited together with the Nigerian project leaders. And this was a very important step in meeting with local leaders, getting their perspective and getting their buy-in so that together they could approach the governments. And what ended up happening was that the project was invited by the minister in Benin in West Africa to have a regional conference that he wanted to host. And it was a very exciting event. I've never quite been at anything like it because we had over 300 people that the scientists ended up inviting. And they particularly invited regional chiefs and leaders because they were such an important stakeholder to help the governments, the ministers here, understand why they need to pay attention to the needs of farmers and really understand the threats that are coming their way and what they could do about them. So this was an example of an outcome that I never would have thought about. Like, it never would have occurred to me that it was important to involve, these traditional leaders. But because the WAVE team as local leaders were so engaged and operating from their culture and their understanding, they had the insights and the know-how and the connection to make this happen. And so it was a powerful experience in getting government buy-in, and all sorts of good things resulted from it. Like, we had one of the governments, for example, went ahead and hired additional scientists to focus on the problem. They agreed to adopt shared phytosanitary regulations to control they agreed to keep each other informed. And this is it's an ongoing process, but it's been really encouraging to see the buy-in and support from important government leaders. Now, one of the things we did together with the government leaders that I thought was really effective and really fun, and that I would offer to you as something to consider as an activity, was something we call the anti-problem. And so this is a way sometimes for groups to get unstuck and think about the problem backwards. And so in this case, we asked everyone, well, how would we spread cassava diseases as effectively as possible? And so, in a way it can feel, well, it's a little bit ridiculous, but it's quite an energizing and enjoyable activity. And so people would come up with things like, well, if we had people carrying cassava plants across borders, if we got on a plane and brought cassava cuttings from Tanzania to Nigeria, so there's all sorts of ways you can come up with if we didn't talk to each other. So if one country had the disease and we didn't tell you that we had it, these are ways that we could help spread the disease. And so then what that lets you do is you generate this list of your anti-problem approaches, and then you can look at that. It enables you to look at it in almost a joyful way, because it can be quite a funny exercise. But then you look at that list and you say, well, hang on a minute, some of these are things that we're actually doing. We're not talking to each other enough. We don't have regulations in place. We're not out there looking to see where the disease is present, so that we can stop it early. And so that enabled the group to then come together and to really think through what they needed to do to change things. I recently discovered that there's an open source website called Liberating Structures, which has got 33 of these type of microstructures to foster lively participation, and basically to get the whole group engaged, and to build good relations and trust. So I offer that to you as just a resource as you think about your meetings, and you're looking for different ways to engage people, so that you get their buy-in and that you can work together to build stronger parishes, or stronger approaches in the domains that you work in. So what I'd like to suggest is that when we're together, that we try one of these liberating structures, because they're actually quite amenable to working with online over Zoom. So I would offer to you questions of, in your parish life or the leadership situation that you're in, what are some examples of complex challenges you face today that you need to address collectively as a community? And then what are some concrete ways that you could include and engage people to make progress on these challenges? So my hope is that by coming together and exploring these questions when we're together live online, that it will give you some insights and actionable approaches that will help you in your own leadership journey, and in the work that you do. I'd really like to invite you, if you have questions, please submit them via the meeting website. I realize this was quite a sciencey presentation, but I hope the things that you can take from it that will help you in your own journey. So thank you very much, and I look forward to our conversation.